Right at the start of Genshin, soon after the Traveler and Paimon make it to Mondstadt, they meet this woman right here, Lisa Mincy, a librarian, a witch. Contrary to her laid-back appearance and carefree personality, Lisa knowingly or unknowingly held one of the records detailing the single greatest act of blasphemous treason to ever be committed in the history of Teyvat. A record that she has now passed down to none other than the fourth descender, the Traveler. The Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies, this intertextuality of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, is a fascinating piece of text indeed, for hidden within its pages is an allegorical retelling of the story of the betrayal that led to the fall of Khaenri'ah. The story of how 6 sinful pygmies murdered their own lord. And of those 6, 5 must pay the price. The 5 sinners of Khaenri'ah. But who exactly did these pygmies betray for them to become known as sinners? Well, that's actually a very good question, and the answer to it lies in the very inception of the Kingdom of Khaenri'ah itself. At the start of Genshin, Hoyoverse, back then MiHoYo, released the Teyvat Prevail trailer, narrated by Dainsleif, outlining the traveler's journey across the 7 nations, with all the nations being assigned chapters that are numbered accordingly, except that trailer has one big intentional flaw. There are 8 nations in Travail, not 7. With the last being Khaenri'ah, and Khaenri'ah stands out like a sore thumb from the other 7. For starters, each of the 7 nations is governed by a deity, while Khaenri'ah is the only one missing a god. And then you have the fact that each of the 7 nations has a name that means something. Either it translates to something or alludes to some location, with Khaenri'ah being once again the odd one out. Having a name that seemingly has no meaning. Keep this in mind. The last and perhaps most important distinction that this nation has in Travail is the fact that while every nation has a corresponding chapter number from 1 to 7, when Travail reaches the Khaenri'ah chapter, rather than it being numbered 8, the chapter's number is surprisingly unknown. There is definitely something wrong going on here. But before I tell you what it might be, let us backtrack a little bit to Khaenri'ah's name. It is abundantly clear that Khaenri'ah is largely based upon Scandinavian and Germanic cultures and mythologies. That much is undeniable. However, Khaenri'ah is a nation that exists beneath Sumeru, and amongst the people of Sumeru, it is known as Dahri. And given what we learn about the 5 sinners from Dainsleif during the Archon Quest Bedtime Story, Khaenri'ah's Sumerian name, Dahri, suddenly carries a far more profound implication. The name Dahri comes from the Arabic word dahr, which has a few interpretations such as era, age, eon, time, or epoch, all of which are directly related to the flow of time. But the most direct and common translations of dahr are eon and time. Dahri itself is a late medieval Islamic term that was used in reference to those who do not believe in the existence of a creator god, so basically atheists, which does make sense given the context of Khaenri'ah as a godless nation in Genshin Impact. However, this is where things start to become very interesting. You see, the reason I highlighted the usage of the term Dahri during the late medieval Islamic era is because that was a significant period in the time of the Islamic Caliphate. For most of its history, the center of the Islamic Empire was located in the capital of Iraq, Baghdad. But following the sacking of Baghdad by the Mongols in the year 1258, the cultural and commercial center of the Caliphate shifted to become Cairo in Egypt. And the rise in prominence of the term Dahri during the time in which Egypt became the commercial center of the Islamic Empire matters a lot for Genshin. Not because of the Islamic Empire, but because of Egypt itself. The most prominent reoccurring cutscene in all of Genshin is the Gnostic chorus of the Battle Pass. And the story told in the Gnostic chorus is based on a Syriac poem called the Hymn of the Pearl that was allegedly written by Thomas the Apostle, one of the disciples of Jesus. And the events of that poem take place in Egypt. This is where the coincidences start to ramp up to the point where they no longer make sense as just mere coincidences. Onto that, Khaenri'ahs are noteworthy for developing an advanced form of alchemy known as the art of Khaenri'ah, where the word Khaenri'ah comes from the Coptic term Kheme. Coptic itself is an effectively extinct language that was spoken in Egypt and is currently used exclusively liturgically by the Coptic Church in Egypt. And the word Kheme means Egypt, and ultimately originates from the ancient Egyptian word Khimt, which refers to the land of Egypt and the color black. Now, black matters a lot in the context of what we are talking about, since in alchemy it is Nigredo, the first stage of the magnum opus, the production of the Philosopher's Stone. All this to say that in addition to Germany and Scandinavia, Khaenri'ah is also likely influenced to some meaningful capacity by Egypt, which retrospectively makes geographical sense knowing how Khaenri'ah was a kingdom located beneath Sumeru, a nation based on much of Egypt and the Middle East. On top of that, the gateway to Khaenri'ah is specifically found under the deserts of Sumeru, which was the territory of the god king Amun. I don't think I need to elaborate on how that guy is related to Egypt. So, remember a few minutes ago when I said that Khaenri'ah's name means nothing and has no translation while each of the 7 nations carry a meaningful name? Alright, I want you all to take a deep breath with me because we might be going to overdose on copium. Egypt is a land with an extraordinarily rich history, but during the late medieval period, when Cairo became the commercial center of the Islamic Caliphate, Arabic was the predominant language across Egypt and remains to this day the country's only official language. Knowing this, the name Khaenri'ah might mean something, just not in English, but rather in Arabic. The English and Arabic alpha... Bro, this is so stupid. Hold on, guys, give me a sec. I need to go grab something. Yes, there we go, much better. The English and Arabic alphabet are not so different. For the most part, every English letter has a close enough Arabic equivalent that produces a similar vocalization like the examples you can see on screen right now. So if we are to take the name Khaenri'ah, split it right down the middle to Khan and Ri'ah, and then replace the letters with their phonetic equivalents in Arabic, we would get Khaenri'ah, which in English directly translates to betrayer wins. And wins is in plural, not singular. This is very important. Also, just to be clear on what I am doing here, this is not a translation. Khaenri'ah does not translate to betrayer wins in Arabic. All I am doing is taking the word Khaenri'ah and pronouncing it as if I was reading it in Arabic. In fact, we don't even need Arabic letters to do this. Here, let me show you. Khaenri'ah, Khaenri'ah, Khaen, betrayer, and Ri'ah, wins. Betrayer wins. Before we continue, a moment of silence for all our fallen brothers and sisters who died from copium overdose. Now, betrayer wins is grammatically inaccurate, both in English and Arabic. It is wrong in both languages. Therefore, we have to extrapolate it into betrayer of the winds, so that it can sound coherent. Great. Betrayer of the winds, now that's a good starting point. But what winds are we talking about here? Is it north winds, south winds, summer winds? Which ones exactly? Well, for that, we would have to go back to Khaenri'ah's Sumerian name, Dahri, which comes from the Arabic word dahr, meaning either eon or time. And if we are to take all this and combine it with the title of the Sumeru book, 1,000 Nights, which tells 6 tales that are likely all allegories for Khaenri'ah, we finally get the true meaning behind the name of Khaenri'ah. The betrayers of the 1,000 winds of time. With this knowledge in mind, suddenly a plethora of other details start to seamlessly connect to one another. The god of the 1,000 winds of time refers to Istaroth, one of the 4 shades of the primordial one and the god of time that was worshipped in ancient Mondstadt alongside the god of freedom Barbatos, who also technically is her son. This explains why Khaenri'ah shares Germanic origins with Mondstadt, and it explains why the emblem of Khaenri'ah is the 8-pointed star of the eclipse, where the 8-pointed star is the symbol of the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, who in Genshin is combined with the Ars Goetia demon Astaroth to form Istaroth. Additionally, you know how the 5 artifact pieces correspond to the primordial one and the 4 shades? As I said earlier, the word dahr in Arabic can directly translate to either time or eon in English, and Istaroth, being the god of time, should correspond to the hourglass piece, which in Genshin is called the Sands of Eon. On top of that, the hourglass device owes its historical origins to either ancient Egypt or Babylon, both of which are monumental to Istaroth and her nation of Khaenri'ah. In other words, the great sin which the Six Pygmies of Khaenri'ah committed was betraying Istaroth. The details of their crime and the punishment they sustained are all described in The Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies, ironically given to the traveler by a witch from the very land where we first ever hear about the Thousand Winds of Time. But the version that the traveler currently has is only but one volume of the entire story. 1 of 7. And it is the opening chapter to boot. That is all we currently have access to. Then again, given the fact that this was a book that the Abyss Order attempted to steal from Lisa's library, claiming it to contain a mighty secret, it is reasonable to assume that the remaining 6 volumes are already in their possession. The book opens up by introducing the main antagonist of the tale, the Night Mother, who rules the distant land of night, with all her subjects being miserable and horrendous denizens of darkness. The land of night was a realm of sin and the embodiment of the Night Mother's evilness, with only one refuge in it, known as the Moonlight Forest, where beautiful creatures with pale skin, light hair, blue eyes, and a fair appearance lived. And that is the extent of the information available in-game right now, but before we continue, I want to point out something that I find odd about this story. The opening chapter establishes the world and introduces its major elements, but something important is missing. You see, we learn about the Land of Night and the Moonlight Forest, along with how the moonlight irritated the Night Mother. But what's peculiar is that the moon is weirdly the only source of light in this world. For some reason, there is no sun. And this matters a lot because the moon cannot produce its own light, at least not in the visible spectrum. Instead, it acts as a mirror reflecting the light of the sun on Earth. There are other reasons why it is worth noting that the sun is missing from the opening chapter, some of which you will see later in this video, because fortunately for us, the rest of the tale is found in the game's files in the form of pieces of unreleased content. The second volume of the book introduces the monarch of the Moonlight Forest, the Pale Princess, who was described as having skin as white as snow, the purest eyes, and the kindest soul in the land. The princess felt that beyond the moon there existed an entire world of its own, a paradise that she wished to one day take her people to. And it is while contemplating the world on the other side of the moon that the Pale Princess one day met a young prince. The prince introduced himself as one who hails from the kingdom of light, from the other side of the world, the diametric opposite of the Night Mother's land of night, the world beyond the reflection of the moon that the Pale Princess wished to take her people to. Seeing her determination to save her people, the Prince of Light held the Pale Princess's hand as they left the Moonlight Forest and journeyed into the dark forest of the Land of Night until they reached the kingdom of the Pygmies. Okay, pause. Remember earlier when I said that the sun is missing in this story? Well, that's the Prince of Light. He is the sun. Or at least he is supposed to represent it, because keep in mind that although the Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies is an allegorical retelling of the fall of Khaenri'ah, multiple things can be going on here at the same time. The ancient Egyptian term for the land of Egypt, Khamt, also refers to black, which later in history became the first stage in the alchemical magnum opus, where Khamt evolved to the Egyptian Coptic term Kheme, and that in turn became the Arabic name for alchemy, Khaenri'ah. Therefore, since Khaenri'ah can be looked at Inteyvat as the land of Egypt, or the alchemical Negredo, black, then the Prince of Light and the Pale Princess's journey to the kingdom of the Pygmies, which by the way that's Khaenri'ah, can also be perceived as a representation of the chemical marriage, the union of white and gold, the lunar queen and the solar king for the sake of the production of Rubidoux, the philosopher's stone. And we know for a fact that the Khaenri'ans, aside from developing the art of Khaenri'ah, were also interested in the magnum opus, with the only exception being that the Eclipse dynasty flipped the final stage from Rubidoux to Citrinitas. At any rate, in the kingdom of the Pygmies, the Pale Princess and the Prince of Light come across a deformed pygmy hiding in the branches of a tree, who begs them to save his brethren in return for their loyalty. And so, the prince and the princess help rescue the deformed pygmy's brothers, who are in order: the blind pygmy, the foolish pygmy, the timid pygmy, the shrunken pygmy, and the carefree pygmy. The Pale Princess accepts them as her own and promises to take them with her to the Kingdom of Light, far away from the Night Mother's rule. On the surface, the Six Pygmies honored their vow, following the princess and her lover whichever way they went. But deep down, the Pygmies were sinful creatures from the land of night, and corruption ran deep in their veins. As the days traveling to the Kingdom of Light grew long and dangerous, they devised amongst themselves a treacherous scheme, so heinous, so blasphemous that only by relaying it to you could I possibly convey the extent of evil in their hearts. The blind pygmy opened his sightless eyes and enjoyed the sunlight greedily. Why not keep the prince with us forever? Instead of believing in unfathomable promises, securing the sunlight before us is our best bet. The foolish pygmy gently patted his scabies-ridden head and gulped the light-filled air rapaciously. I think we should kidnap the prince and use him to make us smarter. That is the smart way. The timid pygmy swung his tiny fists in the air and yelled. All that rascal did was save our lives, and now he acts so condescendingly, treating us like servants. I shall challenge him to a duel. The shrunken pygmy squinted in disdain, his complexion wrinkled up like a piece of crumpled paper. Brothers, you have been hiding in the shadows for too long. The darkness has clouded your judgment. It is new life that we need in order to survive. I say we use the corpse of the prince as fertilizer, so my garden might flourish again. The carefree pygmy sighed and looked sullen.
We'd better get this over with quickly. If it weren't for them, these evil thoughts wouldn't have entered my mind, and I wouldn't have become so somber.
The deformed pygmy was the only one not to join the discussion. Not because he was not evil, but because the guilt of betraying his savior overcame his wicked nature enough to make him keep his mouth shut. Nevertheless, the Six Pygmies all agreed to the plot, poisoning the prince's water and kidnapping him from the princess's side as they slept. They subjugated the prince's body to unimaginable acts of torture and defilement, dividing amongst themselves a power that turned them into transcendent beings, and the six treacherous dogs made a feast to celebrate their success. However, the prince's broken soul used up all of its remaining power to curse the pygmies, making them unable to ever see the light of day again. The deformed pygmy, however, whether out of guilt, loyalty, or fear of the curse we don't know, wrapped the prince's body in a dirty tablecloth and carried it back to the Pale Princess. But unbeknownst to him, the Night Mother had been watching the pygmies like a cat stalking its prey, and by the time the pygmy reached the Pale Princess, he found the Mother of Evil waiting in her stead. He had bound the princess in chains, destroyed the Moonlight Forest, and cursed her people to an eternal state of undeath right before her eyes, as they shall forever linger at the point between life and death. The Night Mother mocked the pygmy, asking him what would become of him when the princess learns of what he had done. Alright, it is abundantly clear that these Six Pygmies are Dainsleif and the Five Sinners of Khaenri'ah, since their identities can be easily traced based on the titles of each pygmy. The blind pygmy is obviously the one who wanted to see, Vedrfolnir, the visionary. The foolish pygmy is the one who wished to become smart, Rhinedottir, the wise. The timid pygmy is the one who wanted courage, that's the moon hunter, Khaenri'ah. The shrunken pygmy, the one who wanted to grow new life, the one after the alchemical magnum opus, Gold, Rhinedottir. And finally, we have the two most prominent pygmies in the main storyline so far, the carefree pygmy and the deformed pygmy. Interestingly, they are also the first and last pygmies whom the prince and the princess encounter, which I think is worth keeping in mind. Additionally, the reason I kept these two for last is because unlike the other four, they aren't depicted in the book to be seeking something specific. The carefree pygmy is Surtaloji, and here Hoyoverse did a smart play on words with his title, the Foul, because foul can refer to someone that is evil, but at the same time, foul can also mean someone who is in a foul mood, a bad mood, the opposite of a carefree person. This leaves us with the deformed pygmy, the one who in the end found it in his heart to try and atone for his sins. He is obviously Dainsleif. But, fairy tales aside, we need a more realistic explanation for why the pygmies murdered the Prince of Light and how that translates to the events which transpire in Khaenri'ah. It is obvious that the Prince of Light, having came from the other side of the moon, is a descender, hence why his power, which is likely what the pygmies divided amongst themselves, turned them into transcendent beings. And remember, in the book Khaenri'ah, it is factually stated that the Khaenri'ahs always yearned for a transcendent being that would usher them unto greater heights. But neither the Crimson Moon nor the Eclipse dynasties were successful at procuring such a creature, at least not until the era of the Cataclysm. It is also clear that Irmin was a very ambitious king who, along with his sages, sought to tear the veil of sin and use the power of the Abyss to change the world itself. And to that end, they likely needed the power of a star, a sun, that can control the Abyss. Because he who controls the Abyss can control everything. This is why one of the travelers, the Abyss sibling, was summoned in Khaenri'ah 500 years ago. However, the Abyss sibling was not a descender. Whoever the sustainer of heavenly principles ended up taking lost their world-rivaling power. It is unclear what exactly happened, but what we know for certain is that the Six Pygmies must have had a major hand in all of this. During the Archon Quest Bedtime Story, Dainsleif says that the five sinners could not resist the call of the Abyss, and ended up betraying Khaenri'ah and dividing amongst themselves a world-shattering power, then abandoned the nation to be destroyed by the Abyss and the gods. And it is for these crimes that Dainsleif is now hunting down these sinners to exact his vengeance upon them. Of the original six, they are the five who must pay the price. But is Dainsleif really much better than them? I think not. Let me tell you why. A long time ago, I made a video attempting to decipher the symbols that make up Dainsleif's quote-unquote element. And there, I found out that some of these symbols are written in the Coptic script. Yes, that's the same Egyptian language from which the Arabic word Khaenri'ah originates. And when put together, these Coptic letters translate to Shesha, as in Adi Shesha, the divine serpent king upon whom the Hindu god Vishnu slumbers in his avatar Narayana. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that video, this is not some bullshit kumbaya nonsense that I'm spouting out right now. Narayana is actually mentioned by name in Genshin Impact inside of a note that René de Petrichor left in the Narcissenkreuz Ordo, where he states that in Sumeru, the word means primordial human. And the Primordial Human Project was a project undertaken in Khaenri'ah by none other than the shrunken pygmy herself, the alchemist Rhinedottir, one of the five sinners whom Dainsleif is currently hunting down. Now, I don't want to restate everything I said in that video because that would be counterproductive and boring, so let us get to the main point. Due to all of the aforementioned information, in addition to a bunch of other stuff such as Dane's constellation being Ouroboros, which in Norse mythology is the world serpent Jormungandr, which invokes the imagery of Vishnu's Adishesha, I concluded that Dainsleif must be the Prince of Light who was thrown inside the hollow of a tree. And we now know for certain this is false. Dainsleif is not the Prince of Light, he is the deformed pygmy, the one who wrapped the prince's body in a dirty tablecloth and hid it inside a tree hole. And when it comes to Dane's element, well, it's actually the same thing. Knowing what the Six Pygmies did to the prince, Dane likely holds one of the fragments of the Prince of Light's power. Alright guys, listen, cut me some slack here. Yes, Dainsleif isn't the Prince of Light, but I was still really close to his true identity. Like, he's the only pygmy who retained some semblance of loyalty in his heart and hid the prince's body from the other 5. The only difference is that instead of being the one who was thrown into the tree, he was the one who did the throwing. Come on, that's close enough. Now, I'm obviously being sarcastic, but at least we now have some semblance of a complete picture of what really happened in the Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies. And all of this being connected to Egypt is very interesting, since the Gnostic chorus of the Battle Pass is narrated by Barbatos, a wisp born from Istaroth, the Thousand Winds of Time, where he speaks of how the King of the Kingdom of Heaven sent his second-born heir to retrieve the Genesis Pearl from a black serpent. This story that Barbatos tells is based on a poem called The Hymn of the Pearl, and the serpent who steals the pearl in that poem resides in the land of Egypt, where the second-born heir goes to retrieve the pearl and ends up getting seduced by the Egyptians and forgets the memory of his birth and noble origins. And of course, if we are to read the name Khaenri'ah in Arabic, the language of modern Egypt, we end up with the betrayers of the Thousand Winds of Time. So Khaenri'ahns betrayed Istaroth, and for them to even be able to betray her to begin with, they must have first been loyal to her for some period of time. This makes sense considering that the emblem of their ruling dynasty was in the image of the 8-pointed star of Ishtar, who in Genshin is Istaroth. However, this raises a whole bunch of new questions. Why the hell would Istaroth, one of the 4 shades of the Primordial One, the king of the gods, be affiliated with a heretical nation that does not acknowledge the gods? Was she some kind of secret god that they had? Could she have possibly been the queen of Khaenri'ah? Was she King Ermin's wife? Or maybe, perhaps, for the kings of Khaenri'ah to ascend to the throne, they had to marry her in some ritual. As you can see, many questions like these arise from such a conclusion. But all of those questions, with no exception, go sideways in the face of one question of paramount importance. Is Istaroth the Pale Princess, the lover of the Prince of Light who was betrayed by the Six Pygmies? Because Dainsleif's words, along with the events that transpire in the fairy tale in addition to Khaenri'ah's name, would all certainly suggest so. And my answer, for now, is no. That is because I still think that the Pale Princess is also the real Princess Fischl, while Istaroth might be her mother. You see, in Flowers for Princess Fischl, Mr. 9 writes that by the time the events of the story take place, Fischl's mother, the Empress of the Immernachtreich, is no longer with us, as if she somehow faded from the world. Which is kinda reminiscent of how Istaroth's name and worship faded into obscurity over time in Inteyvat. This might explain why the Khaenri'ah chapter has no number. The curse laid upon the land could have literally suspended the nation and its people in a state beyond time itself. As for who in Genshin may be the Pale Princess, the only person I can really think of right now is Paimon, but the problem with Paimon is that she could also be one of the Moon Sisters. That is assuming the Pale Princess isn't already one of them to begin with, which is certainly a possibility. Yeah, look, it's complicated. We will see in the future. What isn't complicated, however, is what Dainsleif's revenge entails. By the end of the Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies, after mocking the deformed pygmy, the Night Mother, whether out of a sense of pity or for the sake of tormenting the poor pygmy even more, we don't know, left him a final spark of hope. She told him that in thousands of years to come, a great calamity will descend upon the land of night in the form of a warrior who wields the sunlight that will destroy the kingdom and revive the Prince of Light. The deformed pygmy then hid the prince's body inside the hollow of a tree, becoming the bow keeper, and went on to hunt down the 5 of his brethren, the 5 sinners of Khaenri'ah, who will pay the price. From Skirk, we know that each of the 5 sinners is seeking their own form of perfection, which is fitting when we consider their pursuit of the alchemical magnum opus. I highly suspect that each of the sinners has their own Philosopher's Stone, and our goal later down the line in the story will be to track them down, most likely kill them, and take their stones, which will presumably be used later to revive the Prince of Light. And just to be clear on this matter, the reason I emphasize the Philosopher's Stone, Rubidoux, is because we have evidence that this is the power at work in the heavens, as we have depictions of Celestia using red that date back to even thousands of years in the past. At the end of Penacony in Honkai Star Rail, Acheron says that red is the color of existence, and that makes sense considering that red is also the color of human blood. The same blood that the dragon Neuvillette gave to the Oceanids to turn them into true human life. So it should be to no one's surprise if it turns out that all the major factions on Teyvat are vying for the perfection of the Philosopher's Stone. Although, it is interesting that the Khaenri'ahs swapped the goal of their magnum opus from red to gold. I am sure we will see what that really means in the future, because I reckon that at least one of the 5 sinners whom Dainsleif is hunting, a witch, will have a golden Philosopher's Stone. And that pretty much gets us to the end of this video. Now, I was going to include an approximately 10-minute section going into detail about the similarities that the 5 sinners have with the stories of Dark Souls and Berserk. However, after thinking about it for a bit, I don't really know if that many people will actually care about this stuff. But who knows, I might revisit that topic when we learn more about the sinners later down the line. Also, I do have one final cool detail for those of you who stuck around till the end. One of the reasons why I suspect Istaroth is the mother of the Pale Princess rather than the Pale Princess herself is because by the end of the Teyvat Reveal trailer, Dainsleif says the following.
My memory has all but faded completely, but I will always remember how much she too loved these flowers.
Dain could be referring to several people in that line, but one of the more likely candidates is the Pale Princess. It's intriguing that the Inteyvat flowers bear a strong resemblance to the Cecilia flowers found in Mondstadt, particularly near the Thousand Winds Temple, where Istaroth and Barbatos were once worshipped. Notably, Cecilias are also Barbatos' ascension materials. Now, if it is true that Paimon is the Pale Princess, and given the fact that she is most likely the XP of Kiana Kaslana from Honkai Impact, then her loving the Inteyvat flowers that look very similar to the Cecilias would suddenly become a bit suspicious, since Cecilias grow near the Temple of Istaroth, who once again might be the Pale Princess's mother, while Kiana's mother in Honkai is called Cecilia Shariak. In other words, Cecilia would be Istaroth. But hey, I think that's enough copium for one video, because I need to go and start preparing some lore videos for Imaginarium Theater and most importantly, Il Capitano. Huge thanks to everyone who generously supports this channel on Patreon, and thank all of you for watching this video. Get ready, because we are going to have some really cool lore about the Hexen Circle coming up, so expect me to be back with more witches and Philosopher's Stones in no time. Take care.